The village of Little Whittingham was buried under a brittle layer of frost that morning, the fields beyond the high hedgerows shimmering silver under the weak winter sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the muffled chime of the church bells seemed to carry further than usual, echoing through the crisp air. It was the day of Mr. Arthur Henshaw's funeral, a man whose sudden passing had left the small community buzzing with both sorrow and curiosity. Though respected for his years as the local solicitor, Arthur had, as Miss Marple often reflected, a certain knack for quietly provoking ill will among those whose secrets he unearthed with an innocent question or a stray comment. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar knitted shawl and carrying her little basket, moved along the frost-stiffened path toward St. Giles's Church. At 82, her steps were deliberate rather than hurried, yet she exuded a quiet energy that seemed to make even the sharp winter air pause in admiration. Her eyes, pale blue and deceptively gentle, scanned the procession assembling outside the church doors with an almost imperceptible glimmer of anticipation. She had known Arthur Henshaw for decades. Not intimately, perhaps, but intimately enough to understand the subtle power he wielded over the lives of others. The congregation had gathered in muted clusters. Mrs. Penelope Fairchild, wearing her customary frown and a hat that seemed to have survived 3 decades of village politics, whispered furiously to the vicar's wife, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. Across the frost-crusted cobblestones, the newly widowed Edith Lawton, a slender figure swathed in black, maintained a rigid posture, her expression carefully composed, but betraying the faintest tremor of unease in her hands. Young Henry Morton, barely 20 and nervously tugging at his overlong scarf, avoided looking at anyone directly, though Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes darted to the churchyard gate every few moments. Inside the church, the warmth of the central heater did little to thaw the chill that clung to the marble floors and stone walls. The organist played a soft, lilting hymns as mourners shuffled into the pews. There was a muted civility in their movements, the polite nods, the careful avoidance of eye contact, all masks, Miss Marple noted, behind which the intricate web of the village's private grievances quietly throbbed. Death, she mused silently, often had a way of peeling back pretenses, yet it was rarely the face one expected to reveal. As the service commenced, the vicar delivered a gentle eulogy, speaking of Arthur's steadfast dedication to Little Whittingham and the many lives he had touched. Miss Marple listened politely, her knitting resting idle in her lap. Occasionally, she cast a sidelong glance at the attendees, noting the slight twitch of Mrs. Fairchild's lips when Arthur was described as unfailingly just, or the faint tightening of Edith Lawton's jaw. Subtle shifts, these, trivial to most eyes, but Miss Marple's mind catalogued each nuance like a careful librarian filing volumes of an intricate story. And then, as if the frost itself had conspired with human nature, the air changed. A sudden commotion by the entrance caught her attention, a flurry of whispers, gasps, and a half-stifled exclamation. Miss Marple, with her decades of practice observing human reaction, did not need to turn fully to grasp what had happened. Someone had tripped, or so it appeared at first, but the severity in the way the figures moved suggested more than mere clumsiness. It was a disturbance that rippled through the pews, drawing the eyes of every mourner toward the main aisle. A shrill cry broke the uneasy quiet. He's dead!" The words cut through the murmur like a shard of ice. All heads turned toward the source, the vicar's assistant, standing pale and unsteady by the lectern. There, crumpled against the stone floor, lay a man who was supposed to be carrying a simple bouquet to the altar, his features frozen in a terror. Panic, swift and unrefined, coursed through the room. Some rushed forward to help. Others, paralyzed, watched as a horrifying thought formed in the collective mind. This was no accident. Miss Marple's heart, calm and measured as ever, gave a faint skip, not from fear, but from recognition. Death in Little Whittingham, she reflected, rarely came alone. A funeral, the village's most solemn gathering, had become a stage for something far more intricate, and the subtle rhythms of human behavior around her already whispered the first lines of a story that would need careful untangling. Who had done this, and why choose such a gathering, so public yet intimate, to reveal their intent? The crowd surged, and the vicar attempted to restore order, his voice a trembling anchor in the sea of astonishment. Miss Marple, however, took no part in the immediate commotion. She moved quietly to a side aisle, her eyes scanning not just the fallen man, but the reactions around her. Faces, she noted, revealed more than words ever could. The young Henry Morton's panic seemed almost rehearsed. Edith Lawton's composure wavered too easily. Even the sharp Mrs. Fairchild, who prided herself on maintaining decorum in all matters, betrayed an almost imperceptible flicker of satisfaction. Miss Marple crouched slightly to observe the man on the floor. It was clear. He was beyond help. Yet the precision of his collapse, the angle of his body, and the expression frozen on his face suggested planning, not happenstance. This was a message. And in Little Whittingham, messages were rarely sent without motive, carefully woven through the tapestry of old grudges and secret resentments. As the local constable arrived, pushing through the mass of shocked villagers, Miss Marple's mind worked silently, cataloguing the scene. There would be statements, investigations, and the inevitable rush toward the most convenient culprit. But she, as always, would observe quietly, see what others did not, and follow the delicate threads that connected motive to opportunity, words to action, and past to present. Outside, the winter sun continued to gleam over Little Whittingham, indifferent to the turmoil within the church, and inside, Miss Marple, knitting needles momentarily forgotten, allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. In a village such as this, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and already she sensed that the winter funeral, far from ending with solemn rites, had merely begun. The news of the sudden death had spread through Little Whittingham like wildfire through dry leaves. By midday, the village's narrow streets and cobbled squares thrummed with whispers and speculative murmurs. Miss Marple walked slowly past the shops and cottages, her senses attuned to the subtle shifts in demeanor that no one else would notice. Each villager's reaction was a clue in itself, and already patterns began to emerge in the small dramas playing out around her. Mrs. Penelope Fairchild had stationed herself outside the bakery, a cup of tea clutched in her gloved hands, and she seemed to take a certain grim satisfaction in speaking in hushed, urgent tones to anyone who passed. "I told you, didn't I?" she murmured to Mrs. Collins, the grocer's wife. He had enemies, always prying where he ought not to. This was bound to happen. Her eyes glinted, sharp as the winter frost. She spoke as if confirming some long-held suspicion, yet Miss Marple noticed the subtle twitch in her lips, betraying excitement rather than concern. Across the street, Henry Morton leaned against the post of the village green, avoiding the gaze of those who approached him. His young face, usually unremarkable, now carried a tension that made him seem older than his years. "It must have been an accident," he said quickly when pressed by a neighbor, though the quaver in his voice undermined his protestation. Miss Marple, observing from the shadowed window of the church hall, noted the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the restless movement of his feet. Anxiety, she knew, often masqueraded as innocence, and Henry's display suggested a mind racing far faster than his words admitted. In the post office, Mrs. Edith Lawton carefully folded and refolded the letters on the counter, her eyes darting at every new customer. She spoke little, but when asked if she had known Mr. Henshaw well, her voice betrayed a faint, almost imperceptible sharpness. "We were acquaintances," she said, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the lace collar of her coat. Miss Marple made a mental note. Fear and guilt were often interwoven, but the latter could reveal far more about character than the former. Meanwhile, the local men gathered near the village pub, their conversation a mixture of bravado and unease. Mr. George Fairchild, Penelope's husband, puffed at his pipe and cast glances around the small crowd as though daring anyone to challenge his authority. "It's an outrage. That's what it is," he said. "A man dies in his prime, and no one seems to know why. There must be a culprit, mark my words." His voice carried confidence, yet the slight twitch in his eye betrayed impatience. Men of his sort, Miss Marple knew, often sought to assert control in situations that made them feel powerless. Inside the tea shop, the usual hum of conversation had shifted into a low, nervous murmur. Tables that once bore steaming cups and gossip about minor quarrels now hosted whispered speculations about motives, suspects, and hidden enmities. Miss Marple entered quietly, offering a nod to Mrs. Parker, the shopkeeper, who immediately leaned forward, eager for confirmation of the latest rumors. "Did you hear about poor Mr. Henshaw's funeral?" Mrs. Parker asked, voice trembling slightly with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Such a dreadful thing to happen right there in the church." Miss Marple, stirring her tea, replied softly, "Yes, it is most unfortunate. But sometimes appearances conceal more than they reveal." Her words, gentle and seemingly idle, caused Mrs. Parker to pause, her brow furrowing in curiosity. Miss Marple's skill lay in speaking without drawing attention to the weight behind her observations. Each listener, of course, interpreted her remarks according to their own anxieties, not realizing that she was collecting information far beyond what they themselves would admit. Outside, a group of school children, bundled in woolen scarves and mittens, gossiped in low tones as they trudged home from their lessons. "They say it wasn't an accident," whispered little Margaret Ellis, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Someone did it on purpose." Her friend, Thomas, nodded solemnly. Children, Miss Marple often noted, were startlingly honest in their observations, noticing details adults dismissed as trivial, and the truth, she reminded herself, often hid in such trivialities. By afternoon, the village green had become a hub for more heated discussions. Passers-by stopped to exchange opinions, each adding conjecture, half-truths, and rumors to the growing tapestry of confusion. Mrs. Fairchild's voice could be heard again, sharper now, almost triumphant. It must have been someone close to him. Who else could manage such precision? The word hung in the air, unspoken but understood. There was cunning behind the tragedy, not mere chance. Miss Marple observed all this from the edge of the crowd, her blue eyes calm and discerning. She noticed the smallest gestures, Mr. Fairchild's hand brushing too casually against his coat pocket, Edith Lawton's fleeting glance toward the village hall, Henry Morton's sudden shift in stance as someone approached. Each movement, each nervous tick, was a thread, and she began to see the web forming a bar-by. Delicate, intricate design, connecting opportunity, motive, and human folly. Even the constable, who had now returned from the church with a report, appeared flustered as he tried to collect statements. He questioned villagers politely, yet he relied on the most obvious facts: the time of the incident, the location, and who had been closest. Miss Marple noted the limitations of his approach. Evidence of human nature, she knew, often lay not in statements or alibis, but in subtle contradictions, fleeting expressions, and the way people unconsciously betrayed their own stories. By late afternoon, the village square had settled into a tense routine. Those who could offer support moved cautiously among the bereaved. Those seeking answers whispered to anyone willing to listen. Miss Marple, sitting quietly on a frost-dusted bench, allowed the chaos to wash over her. She did not need to speak or act immediately. Observation, patience, and a careful catalogue of human behavior were her instruments. Already the first layers of deception, anxiety, and resentment had begun to surface, revealing the hidden skeletons of little Whittingham's seemingly peaceful community. As the winter sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the frozen square, Miss Marple rose slowly and adjusted her shawl. She had seen enough for now to understand that the village's outward calm was merely a facade. Beneath it lay a tension that had existed for years, and the funeral, which was meant to mark the end of one life, had awakened something far older, far more intricate. It would be her task to trace the lines of human behavior that led to the tragedy and uncover the carefully concealed truth. And so, while the villagers argued, whispered, and speculated, Miss Marple walked home, slowly, her mind quietly threading together the first strands of what promised to be a very complex puzzle. She knew that in a place like Little Whittingham, where every secret was cherished yet fragile, the truth would not reveal itself willingly. Patience, subtlety, and a keen eye for detail would be required, and she, as always, possessed all three. The morning after the shocking incident, Little Whittingham awoke under a heavier silence than usual. Frost still clung stubbornly to the hedgerows, and the distant chiming of the church bells carried a subdued, almost mournful tone. Miss Marple, as ever, was up early, moving quietly through the village streets in her familiar shawl and sensible boots. She carried no notebook or magnifying glass, only her keen observations, which, to her, were often far more telling than any instrument of detection. Her first stop was the church. The vicar had insisted that she sit quietly in the vestry, out of the way, while he conducted preliminary inquiries with the few villagers willing to speak. Miss Marple accepted the arrangement with her usual polite nod, noting the tremor in his hands as he gestured toward the pews where the congregation had gathered. "It is quite dreadful," he said. "I fear the police may be overwhelmed by the sheer number of statements they must take." Miss Marple replied softly, "Sometimes, Reverend, people say far more than they realize if you are willing to listen rather than interrogate." The vicar looked at her, half curious, half uncertain, as if sensing that her words carried a truth he could not quite define. The first to arrive was young Henry Morton, pale and jittery, his scarf twisted awkwardly around his neck. He approached with hesitant steps, bowing slightly in an attempt to appear composed. I didn't see much," he began, then faltered, clearly unsure whether he should admit even what he had glimpsed. Miss Marple, observing closely, noted the rapid blink of his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted with the strap of his satchel. It was not the behavior of a simple bystander, she thought, but of someone who had seen, or perhaps done, more than he wished to admit. As he spoke, Miss Marple listened carefully, her mind threading together inconsistencies. "You were near the vestry door when the incident occurred?" she asked mildly, not seeking to accuse, only to clarify. Henry nodded rapidly. Yes, but I didn't touch anything, I swear." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying a tension that ran deeper than mere fear. Miss Marple made no comment, merely noting the hesitation, the subtle overemphasis. Nervousness often revealed what a person wished to conceal. Next came Edith Lawton, whose composed demeanor seemed to crumble the instant she stepped into the vestry. Her eyes flicked around the room and she adjusted the lace collar of her coat with a tremor that suggested anxiety or guilt. "I can hardly bear to think of poor Mr. Henshaw," she said, her voice carefully measured. "It is such a shock." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, noticed the brief dart of her gaze toward the vestry table, as if measuring the room for something unseen. A woman's glance, she reminded herself, often revealed far more than words. The vicar, aware of Miss Marple's quiet presence, whispered, "Do you think we should call the constable?" She shook her head subtly. "Let him gather statements, yes, but he will miss the subtleties. People rarely give away the truth when asked directly. One must observe how they speak, what they glance at, and what they wished to avoid. By mid-morning, the local constable arrived, notebooks and official air in tow. He politely began taking formal statements from the few villagers who had been present. Miss Marple allowed him his work, but her eyes never left the subtle gestures, the slight changes in posture, the faint color variations on faces as certain topics arose. She noticed Mrs. Fairchild's lips twitch when Henry Morton's name was mentioned, the way Edith Lawton's hands clutched a handkerchief as though it were a talisman. Even small, seemingly trivial details, the crooked angle of a hat, the hesitation in a cough, were catalogued with care. Miss Marple then took a quiet walk along the path to the churchyard, observing the scene from the outside. The ground was frozen hard, but the outline of footprints and the slight disturbance of frost indicated the movement of several villagers during the incident. Most of these were inconsequential, she decided, but a few spoke of more deliberate pacing, as if someone had lingered in the vicinity with intent. The eye often deceives itself, she reminded herself. Yet the human instinct for self-preservation rarely covers every trace. Later, she visited the small row of shops along the high street. Each proprietor had their version of the story. Mr. Collins, the grocer, was particularly emphatic. "I saw him approach the altar. It was like he froze, then collapsed." He shook his head, as if trying to reconcile the impossibility of what he witnessed. Miss Marple asked innocuous questions, carefully avoiding judgment. "Did you notice anything unusual before he approached?" Mr. Collins frowned, then paused. "Well, the girl delivering the flowers seemed nervous, but perhaps that was just nerves." Miss Marple's ears perked slightly. The girl, someone to observe further. By midday, the village had settled into an uneasy routine. Miss Marple, returning home for a brief rest, reflected on the fragments she had gathered. Everyone seemed to carry a secret, whether conscious or not, and each secret could be a clue, or a red herring. She recalled the fleeting expressions of shock and relief, tension and calculation as villagers recounted their version of events. Social appearances, she thought, are the most delicate of masks, and the slightest tremor often betrayed the truth beneath. Miss Marple's quiet analysis extended to the relationships she had long observed. Mrs. Fairchild's assertive nature and her husband's need for control, Henry Morton's nervous youth, Edith Lawton's careful composure masking anxiety, all were threads woven into the intricate social fabric of Little Whittingham. And Mr. Henshaw, with his subtle probing of others' weaknesses, had undoubtedly disturbed more than one carefully constructed facade. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple paused by the window, watching as the frost glinted in the low winter sun. She could see neighbors glancing toward the churchyard, some out of genuine concern, others with curiosity sharp as knives. Even in their quiet routines, small clues appeared, an unusual gait, a lingering look, the tension in a hand gripping a gate. Each would prove invaluable, she knew, when piecing together the sequence of events that had led to the tragic collapse during the funeral. As evening approached, she made herself tea and sat quietly, reflecting on the day's observations. The early investigation, she realized, would not rely on documents or forensic tests. It would depend on patience, intuition, and careful attention to the subtleties of human behavior. Little Whittingham, she mused, was a village of delicate social balances, and a single misstep, or a hidden resentment, could tip the scales toward catastrophe. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the key points: the nervous youth, the composure hiding fear, the overconfidence masking guilt. Each would need further observation. Each might conceal more than they admitted, and somewhere, woven into the frost-dusted streets and quiet cottages of Little Whittingham, was the truth waiting to be discovered by someone who could read the silent language of human nature. She sipped her tea, her knitting idle on her lap. The first threads of understanding had begun to form. In Little Whittingham, appearances were never what they seemed, and she, as always, would follow the threads to their conclusion, quietly, unobtrusively, yet with a precision that no one suspected. The winter funeral, far from ending, had only begun to reveal the hidden currents beneath the village's calm exterior. By the second day after the funeral, Little Whittingham had divided itself neatly into factions of suspicion. The small village, usually content with minor quarrels over garden fences or gossip about the vicar's sermons, now had a single unifying topic: the death at the church. Though the constable had begun taking statements and inspecting the scene, it was the villagers themselves who, in whispered corners and behind curtained windows, constructed the first versions of guilt. The most obvious suspect, according to the majority, was Henry Morton. The young man's nervous behavior during the funeral, combined with his unexplained presence near the altar, had become the centerpiece of the village narrative. "Mark my words," Mrs. Fairchild had told anyone who would listen. "It's that boy. He was trembling like a leaf and fidgeting with his scarf. I saw him linger after the others left." Her husband, George, nodded grimly beside her, his pipe clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Yes, the constable will find him involved somehow," he added, speaking as if his certainty could substitute for proof. Miss Marple, watching from the edge of the village green, noted the eagerness with which the accusations fell on Henry. Young people were often convenient scapegoats, she reflected, because their lack of experience made their reactions seem suspicious. Yet she also noted the finer details. Henry's eyes darted toward the churchyard gate when certain villagers approached, and his hands trembled not with malice but with anxiety that seemed almost genuine. If the boy were guilty, it would be in his hands, she thought, and yet the tension felt wrong, misaligned with the accusation everyone was so ready to make. Edith Lawton, on the other hand, became a subject of quiet speculation in more restrained circles. Her apparent composure had fascinated some, but others found it unnerving. "She knew Mr. Henshaw well enough to have a motive," whispered Mrs. Parker in the tea shop. "People never behave like that unless there's something to hide." The remark, casual in tone, caused ripples of agreement among those sipping tea. Miss Marple's own observations, however, told a subtler story. Edith's eyes often lingered too long on empty chairs or the corners of rooms where shadows fell. Nervousness, perhaps, but carefully controlled. There was thoughtfulness, perhaps guilt, but the question remained: whose and why? The constable, though polite and methodical, displayed the typical reliance on the obvious. He noted Henry Morton's proximity, Edith Lawton's presence, and even the unusual excitement of Mrs. Fairchild, yet he failed to see the undercurrents Miss Marple discerned with ease. He gathered statements, recorded alibis, and questioned the villagers systematically, yet he overlooked what she considered the vital elements: subtle glances, half-formed hesitations, and the deliberate masking of minor details that might point to a carefully orchestrated act. Meanwhile, gossip spread through Little Whittingham like fire across dry leaves. Shopkeepers leaned across counters to whisper suspicions to anyone within earshot. Mrs. Parker repeated the same line to multiple customers. It must be someone who had a reason to be near the altar. Someone trusted, but secretly resentful. Each retelling subtly altered the story, adding a layer of drama and complexity, until the original event seemed almost secondary to the unfolding narrative of human motives and imagined plots. Miss Marple, quietly listening, catalogued each version with care, noting not just what was said, but the character of those who said it. People, she thought, reveal more about themselves when speaking of others than when speaking of themselves. In the churchyard, meanwhile, the village constable examined the immediate scene. Frost marked the impressions of hurried footsteps and the scuff of someone who had stopped and lingered. He took notes diligently, unaware that the precise placement of a single footprint, lightly pressed into the frost, might indicate intent far more subtle than a hasty approach. Miss Marple crouched briefly to study the impressions herself. The pattern was curious, deliberate, almost as if someone had positioned themselves carefully before the fatal collapse occurred. She made a mental note to inquire about who might have moved through the space that morning, paying attention not to the obvious, but to the small deviations from expected behavior. As the day progressed, a few villagers began suggesting that the death might not have been accidental at all, though none dared speak too loudly. He didn't stumble. Not really, muttered Mr. Collins, the grocer. Something startled him, perhaps. Perhaps someone wanted him gone. His voice dropped to a whisper, as though saying it aloud might summon suspicion upon himself. Miss Marple, observing from the doorway of her cottage, noted the careful avoidance in his gaze and the slight twitch of his left eyebrow, a subtle indication of inner conflict, or perhaps fear of revealing more than he intended. By evening, the constable had arranged interviews with the few villagers closest to the church during the incident. Henry Morton recounted his presence near the altar. Edith Lawton described her positioning in the pew, and Mrs. Fairchild offered a vivid, though increasingly exaggerated account of Henry's trembling hands and wide-eyed expression. The repetition of these details, she noted, often revealed more about the observer than the observed. Patterns emerged, not in the actions themselves, but in the interpretations, exaggerations, and assumptions layered upon them. Miss Marple, as usual, remained quiet. She did not confront, accuse, or even appear to observe too keenly. Instead, she focused on minor inconsistencies. The misalignment of a watch, a handkerchief slightly dampened, a scarf that had been adjusted repeatedly without reason. Each small, almost imperceptible movement suggested a story hidden beneath the veneer of polite conversation. The villagers' eagerness to point fingers at Henry Morton, while understandable, was likely a diversion from subtler dynamics, she thought. Dynamics that involved carefully concealed motives and long-standing resentments. Finally, as twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple took her usual slow walk along the lanes leading back to her cottage. The frost glinted in the fading light, and the houses, though quiet, seemed to exhale suspicion through their chimneys. She considered the suspects, the obvious and the overlooked, and catalogued in her mind the first impressions of each. Henry Morton's fear, Edith Lawton's careful composure, Mrs. Fairchild's aggressive certainty, and even Mr. Collins' nervous hesitations formed a rough constellation. Each star, she knew, could illuminate the truth, or mislead entirely. The first suspects had been named. The village, in its rush for closure, would clamor for swift justice. But Miss Marple, ever patient, recognized that truth rarely coincided with popular opinion. Observing human behavior with subtlety, noting small contradictions, and following instinct guided by experience would, in time, reveal the real story behind the sudden death during the winter funeral. The constable and the villagers might see only the surface, but Miss Marple's eyes, quiet, steady, and discerning, were attuned to the currents beneath. The morning after the first round of statements, Miss Marple rose with the usual quiet determination, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the lingering frost. The village streets were nearly empty, save for a few early shoppers and the occasional clatter of a cart. The sun, weak and pale, barely warmed the cold air. Miss Marple had resolved to visit the churchyard once more, not to disturb the scene, but to observe what might reveal itself in the calm light of day. Details the frantic rush of the funeral and immediate gossip had obscured. As she walked, she reflected on the first impressions of the suspects. Henry Morton's anxiety was evident, but inconsistent with deliberate malice. Edith Lawton's carefully measured composure concealed a tension too fine to be malicious, yet significant. Mrs. Fairchild's insistence on assigning blame suggested a personal eagerness. perhaps to protect someone, or herself. And Mr. Collins, the grocer, seemed almost afraid to admit what he had seen, or to speculate too freely. Each was a thread in the intricate web of human motives, but she sensed there was a more subtle clue waiting, one that had been entirely overlooked. The churchyard was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a frost-shivering robin. Miss Marple moved slowly toward the spot where the man had collapsed, her eyes scanning the surrounding ground. Most villagers had assumed that the collapse was sudden and unremarkable. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small, nearly imperceptible irregularity, a faint smear on the edge of the altar step, almost hidden by frost and fallen leaves. It was not large, nor immediately alarming, but its placement suggested that something had been moved or brushed against shortly before the fatal incident. She knelt carefully to examine it, noting the subtle difference in texture where the frost had partially melted. It was not mud, nor merely the mark of a careless step. The smear hinted at contact, a disturbance so slight that only someone with a practiced eye would notice. Miss Marple, having observed human behavior for decades, immediately suspected that this small mark, ignored by the police and overlooked by the anxious villagers, could prove pivotal. Her mind considered possibilities. Had someone brushed against the altar to remove or conceal an object? Had a dropped item been nudged into place or hidden in haste? The mark was minor, but in Little Whittingham, she reminded herself, minor details often carried the weight of intention. What seemed inconsequential to the untrained eye could reveal not only opportunity, but motive. As she studied the ground, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Henry Morton. The boy had lingered near the altar, yes, but his movements had been restless and almost chaotic. Could the smear be linked to him, or was it the mark of someone more deliberate, someone familiar with the space and confident in their control over appearances? Her instinct told her the latter. Children often frightened easily, but careful planning was another matter entirely. Her attention was drawn then to a small fragment of fabric caught on the edge of the step. It was fine, dark, and had the faint sheen of silk, an unlikely material for a working man or a child. Miss Marple picked it up gingerly, her rough fingers deft despite the cold. She turned it over, noting the delicate weave and subtle embroidery at the edge. A handkerchief, a scarf, possibly something that had slipped from a coat or pocket unnoticed. Its presence, she realized, could place someone at the altar just before the incident, contradicting casual statements or the assumptions of the constable. Miss Marple returned the fragment carefully to her pocket. The day's calm allowed her to see the scene with clarity impossible during the funeral itself. Her eyes roamed over the surrounding pews and steps, noting minor disturbances. The faint indentations where shoes had pressed against frost, a scuff on the edge of a pew, a droplet of melted frost on the stone floor. Each small imperfection suggested movement, hesitancy, or concealment. Most of the villagers had focused on the collapse itself. Miss Marple, as usual, focused on what had preceded it. She paused to consider the implications. Someone had been at the altar before the fatal moment, deliberately or otherwise, and the traces they left were subtle enough that only an observant eye would catch them. The constable would likely dismiss these details as trivial. Villagers would continue to point fingers at the obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth often lay in what everyone else ignored. The tiny fragment, the barely noticeable smear, the subtle misalignment of a stone or leaf. Her next stop was the vestry, where the vicar kept the items used during services. Miss Marple moved quietly, opening a small cupboard to examine the space for any missing or displaced objects. Everything appeared in order, yet she noted the position of a small brass candlestick. It seemed slightly out of alignment, as if adjusted hastily, not by accident. Perhaps it had been moved to conceal evidence or distract attention. Every small detail mattered, she reminded herself, especially in a village where even minor social maneuvers carried weight. Later, she walked along the path toward the cottages of Henry Morton and Edith Lawton, considering their movements the previous day. She noted the subtle ways both had avoided full eye contact with the constable, the small hesitations in their speech, and the nervous gestures that betrayed anxiety or concealment. Yet neither had appeared to engage in deliberate mischief at the altar. The smear, the fragment, the subtle shifts in position, these suggested an adult, deliberate, confident in their ability to manipulate appearances. Returning home, Miss Marple made herself tea and placed the fragment of silk carefully on the table. She considered the constable's statements, the villagers' gossip, and the minor inconsistencies she had observed. Something small, almost invisible, had already begun to reveal a pattern. The real culprit, she suspected, was not the obvious suspect, but someone clever, cautious, and intimately familiar with both the church and the habits of the villagers. As the frost outside began to soften under the weak winter sun, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting momentarily forgotten. The village continued to chatter, gossip, and point fingers at Henry Morton or Edith Lawton. Yet she knew better. The hidden clue, the smear on the altar step, the fragment of silk, the slight misalignment of the brass candlestick, was the beginning of a trail that would ultimately lead her to the truth. In Little Whittingham, she reflected, nothing could be taken at face value. Subtlety, patience, and a careful eye for detail would uncover what the hurried judgments of others could not. And so, while the villagers speculated, Miss Marple observed, catalogued, and pondered. The winter funeral had not ended with the collapse. It had begun a story woven of human ambition, secret motives, and hidden actions. And the first real clue, invisible to all but her, had already revealed the faintest trace of the path the truth would follow. The days following the discovery of the hidden clue were tense in Little Whittingham. The village, ordinarily calm and orderly, had grown restless. People whispered behind curtains, and cautious glances were exchanged in the market, the post office, and the tea shop. Miss Marple, quietly observant as always, noted these subtle signs of unease, understanding that human behavior often revealed what words concealed. The hidden clue, the smear on the altar step, the fragment of silk, had yet to reveal its full significance, but it had already begun to stir the currents of suspicion and fear in the village. Miss Marple's first visit was to Mrs. Fairchild, whose reputation for gossip was well known. The older woman received her with a mix of excitement and guarded propriety. "I do hope you have news, Miss Marple," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We all fear that the worst is yet to come. Someone in our midst has committed an unforgivable act." Her voice, though loud and dramatic, betrayed a certain eagerness. She wanted the truth, yes, but more than that, she wanted affirmation that her suspicions were correct. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, responded gently, "One must be careful not to leap to conclusions, Mrs. Fairchild. The obvious is not always the truth." The older woman's lips pressed together briefly, a flash of irritation passing across her face before she returned to her carefully composed demeanor. Miss Marple noted the twitch, small but telling. People's responses to gentle corrections often revealed where pride, fear, or guilt lingered. Later that morning, Edith Lawton called at Miss Marple's cottage under the guise of delivering a basket of baked goods. Her hands were steady, but her eyes betrayed an underlying anxiety. "I wish to thank you for your kind attention during the last few days," she said, placing the basket on the table. "It has been overwhelming." Miss Marple studied her quietly, noting the way Edith's eyes occasionally flicked toward the windows and the door as though checking for observers. Nervousness was understandable in the wake of a shocking death, yet Miss Marple's experience suggested that careful attention to such fleeting reactions could reveal deeper truths. "You have been very composed, Edith," Miss Marple observed gently. "Do you find the village's curiosity trying?" Edith paused, hands tightening slightly around the basket. "It is trying," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But composure is necessary, is it not? One must maintain dignity even when circumstances are disturbing." Her choice of words and the precise control in her tone hinted at effort, a conscious management of emotion. Miss Marple noted it, storing the detail alongside her other observations. Henry Morton, meanwhile, became increasingly isolated. The village's suspicion weighed heavily upon him, and his interactions were brief and awkward. Miss Marple observed him from the market as he spoke hurriedly with the butcher, avoiding eye contact with anyone else. A sudden flinch when Mrs. Fairchild passed suggested fear, but fear of accusation rather than guilt. Children often reacted strongly to social pressure, she reminded herself, their anxiety magnified by the adult world around them. Henry's nervousness, while conspicuous, did not align entirely with malicious intent. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the village lanes, reflecting on the relationships among the key figures. She considered Mrs. Fairchild's domineering nature, Edith Lawton's careful composure, Henry Morton's youthful anxiety, and the quiet deference shown by many villagers toward Mr. Collins. There were subtle tensions, hints of old grievances, and resentments carefully buried beneath layers of politeness. For example, Edith had inherited a small cottage on the edge of the village, a property she had acquired after a legal dispute in which Mr. Henshaw had acted as mediator. Mrs. Fairchild, known for her competitive nature, had expressed irritation over the outcome at the time, though she had long since concealed it beneath social niceties. Miss Marple's thoughts then turned to a man less obvious, Mr. Collins, the grocer. He had seemed polite, even hesitant when speaking of the incident, yet his minor hesitations and careful phrasing suggested knowledge he was reluctant to disclose. People often revealed what they wished to hide in subtle gestures, the twitch of a finger, a quick glance, a slightly forced smile. Miss Marple catalogued each moment, understanding that human behavior often carried its own truth independent of words. Later, a confrontation occurred at the tea shop. Mrs. Fairchild, unable to contain her suspicion, approached Edith Lawton, her voice low but sharp. "You must know something. How else could such a tragedy occur?" Edith maintained her composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down a teacup. "I assure you, Penelope, I know nothing beyond what any other villager has seen," she said. Miss Marple, observing from a corner, noted the careful choice of words, the micro-adjustments in posture, the faint tightening of her jaw. Such details, small though they were, could signal awareness of events or a defensive instinct in response to implied accusation. Henry Morton, overhearing the exchange, shrank back, almost colliding with the table. His youth made him visible to the eye, yet easily dismissed in terms of culpability. His fear was raw, immediate, and unpracticed, a contrast to the controlled anxiety of adults who had long learned the art of concealment. Miss Marple, noting the difference, considered that fear could point both toward guilt and innocence. The boy's terror suggested the latter, though she would continue to observe for any inconsistencies. The afternoon shadows lengthened, and the village seemed to hold its collective breath. Small conversations carried accusations, half-truths, and speculation like a current moving through the air. Miss Marple, strolling along the quiet lane back to her cottage, catalogued each exchange. She had noticed a recurring pattern. Villagers often revealed more about their own pasts, grievances, or secret ambitions than they did about the event itself. Subtle resentments, carefully nurtured over years, had begun to surface in the aftermath of the funeral. By evening, Miss Marple returned home, settling by the fire with her knitting and the fragment of silk she had previously discovered. She reflected on the day's observations, the confrontations she had witnessed, and the hidden tensions that now surfaced among the villagers. Each person had displayed their character through word, gesture, and glance. Mrs. Fairchild's eagerness to assign blame, Edith Lawton's carefully maintained composure, Henry Morton's unpracticed fear, and Mr. Collins' subtle hesitation all painted a picture of a village in which social intricacies and hidden grievances were intertwined with a fatal incident. Miss Marple, as always, waited. She did not act hastily or accuse prematurely. Observation, subtle analysis, and patient reflection would uncover the truth. The confrontation of secrets had begun, and she understood that these small revelations would eventually form the foundation upon which the real story could be built. In Little Whittingham, appearances were a fragile veil, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, unassuming manner, was patient enough to watch it fall, one subtle gesture at a time. By the 7th day after the winter funeral, Little Whittingham had grown accustomed to a tense, uneasy routine. Villagers whispered behind drawn curtains, glanced anxiously at one another, and walked with heightened awareness of the frost-crusted streets. The constable's inquiries continued, though he remained largely focused on the obvious suspects, leaving many subtleties unnoticed. Miss Marple, as always, observed with a calm, unassuming diligence, noting the smallest gestures and changes in behavior. Yet just as the village began to settle into this uneasy rhythm, another twist sent ripples through the community, deepening the mystery and unsettling even the most composed. The twist came in the form of a letter delivered early one morning to the vicarage. It was written in a delicate, unfamiliar hand and bore no return address. The envelope was slipped through the letterbox silently, leaving behind only a faint trace of lavender. The vicar, reading its contents aloud to Miss Marple and the constable, displayed a visible tremor in his hands. "This," he said, voice quivering, "was addressed to me. Yet it contains a warning regarding Mr. Henshaw's death. It suggests that what we have observed is only part of the story. The writer claims that a second incident may occur if certain truths remain hidden." Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed slightly. A threat disguised as a letter was a deliberate act intended to provoke fear, mislead, or manipulate? Such an intervention was rare in Little Whittingham, a village accustomed to measured gossip rather than outright intimidation. She noted the constable's frown and the vicar's pale face, recognizing the emotional response most would display when confronted by unseen danger. Her mind, however, focused on possibilities. Who had the knowledge, the motive, and the nerve to send such a letter? By mid-morning, the news of the letter had reached several villagers, transmitted carefully through intermediaries. Mrs. Fairchild, ever eager to assert herself, immediately began speculating on potential perpetrators. "It must be someone close to the church. How else could they know about what happened at the altar?" she exclaimed to anyone who would listen. Her voice, strident and confident, carried through the narrow lanes, drawing attention and opinion from those passing by. Miss Marple noted her readiness to leap to conclusions, as well as the subtle satisfaction in her eyes, an eagerness to prove she had been right all along. Edith Lawton, upon hearing the news, appeared thoughtful but not alarmed. She had come to the tea shop to deliver some bread to Mrs. Parker and had overheard the mention of the letter. "A letter," she murmured, "can say anything, yet reveal little. The handwriting, the phrasing, even the choice of lavender. These are details one must consider carefully." Her tone, measured and analytical, suggested more awareness than mere fear. Miss Marple took note, considering whether Edith's calmness masked knowledge or simply reflected a capacity for restraint under pressure. Henry Morton, however, was visibly unsettled. He lingered outside the post office, avoiding eye contact, glancing frequently over his shoulder as if anticipating another unseen danger. His youth, combined with genuine fear, made his reactions appear sincere, yet Miss Marple remained watchful. Children and young people often react strongly to perceived threats, amplifying every stimulus. His visible fear could be both a protective instinct and a natural response to village hysteria. It was important to distinguish instinctive reaction from conscious deceit. The constable, though alarmed by the letter, continued with his routine, visiting the church, inspecting the altar, and taking new statements from villagers. His methodology remained conventional, focused on physical evidence and testimony. Miss Marple, however, noted the absence of attention to human behavior, a detail far more telling than the letter itself. The subtle cues, the nervous glance, the slight hesitation before speaking, the overemphasis on reassurance, often revealed far more than any written warning could. Later that afternoon, another unexpected development added to the tension. Mr. Collins, the grocer, reported that a small object had been found near the churchyard gate. It was a delicate brooch, partially hidden beneath a dusting of frost. Its design was intricate, floral, and unmistakably belonging to a lady of some refinement. The brooch had been noted by no one before, suggesting it had been dropped or placed recently. Miss Marple examined it carefully, noting faint traces of soil and the pattern of frost adhering to one side. Its placement suggested deliberate concealment, an attempt either to plant evidence or misdirect the investigation. The villagers gathered at the scene almost immediately, their collective curiosity and anxiety intensifying. Mrs. Fairchild seized the opportunity to point fingers once again. "See," she exclaimed, holding the brooch aloft. "This proves there is a cunning hand at work. Someone among us is trying to manipulate the situation. Mark my words." Her voice was loud, insistent, and slightly theatrical, drawing murmurs of agreement, suspicion, and fear from those nearby. Miss Marple, ever attentive, catalogued the expressions of each witness, the surprise, the hesitation, and the subtle relief in some, the sharp curiosity in others. Miss Marple's own thoughts, however, remained focused on the subtleties rather than the spectacle. The brooch, she observed, was not merely a personal belonging. It was a tool in a larger pattern of deception. Its placement, paired with the letter, suggested someone who understood both the village's routines and the psychological impact of minor discoveries. Whoever had orchestrated these events sought to manipulate attention, amplify fear, and conceal the true culprit behind layers of distraction. By evening, Little Whittingham had descended into a tense, anxious murmur. Conversations in the tea shop and along the high street revolved around the letter, the brooch, and the possibility of further danger. Miss Marple, observing discreetly, noticed how fear reshaped interactions. Some villagers became more guarded, others more accusatory, and a few subtly shifted alliances. The social fabric of the village, delicate under normal circumstances, was now strained almost to snapping. Miss Marple retired to her cottage with a quiet resolve. The additional twist, the threatening letter and the mysterious brooch, had complicated the investigation, yes, but it had also provided insight. The orchestrator was meticulous, patient, and psychologically adept, manipulating the reactions of villagers and authorities alike. Such a person would likely be confident, familiar with the habits of the community, and skilled at masking true intent behind plausible innocence. As she sipped her tea and pondered the day's events, Miss Marple catalogued every nuance. The reactions of Henry Morton, Edith Lawton, Mrs. Fairchild, Mr. Collins, and the constable, the placement of the brooch, the phrasing of the letter, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered on the envelope. Each detail, minor as it seemed, was a piece of the puzzle. The real story, she knew, was far more intricate than the village suspected. The winter funeral had not concluded. It had merely entered its most deceptive and complex stage. Miss Marple's keen mind, honed through years of quiet observation, was already weaving these subtle threads into a coherent pattern. The twist had intensified the stakes, tested the patience of villagers, and revealed the skill of someone determined to manipulate appearances. Yet, as always, she remained calm, methodical, and patient. In Little Whittingham, truth was rarely immediate, but it was never beyond reach for those willing to watch closely and think carefully. Miss Marple awoke that morning with a quiet sense of purpose. The village of Little Whittingham, though outwardly calm, thrummed with tension. The letter, the brooch, and the observations she had gathered over the past week had all pointed toward one undeniable truth. The culprit had been careful, deliberate, and psychologically skilled. To reveal them, she would need more than observation. She would need to provoke a response, to create a situation in which their behavior betrayed their intent. Her plan was subtle, simple in appearance, yet precise in execution. It would involve the very people who had been under suspicion, the key players whose movements and reactions she had catalogued: Henry Morton, Edith Lawton, Mrs. Fairchild, and, most importantly, the quiet Mr. Collins. Miss Marple's cottage, warm and inviting, would serve as the setting for her test, disguised under the pretense of a social visit, a cup of tea, a polite conversation, and the gentle airing of village gossip. By mid-morning, the first visitor arrived. Henry Morton, pale but eager, entered with the careful deference of youth. Miss Marple welcomed him with her customary charm. "I thought it might be nice to discuss the village, Henry," she said lightly, "and perhaps to hear your thoughts on recent events." The boy shifted uncomfortably, hands clasped, eyes darting to the window. Miss Marple did not press. Instead, she observed. His discomfort, natural and unpracticed, confirmed what she had long suspected. His nervousness stemmed from fear, not culpability. Edith Lawton arrived next, her composure intact, yet subtly enhanced by the awareness of being observed. She carried herself with elegance, placing a basket of pastries on the table. "I hope you do not mind my visit, Miss Marple," she said, voice calm and measured. "I thought some refreshments might ease the tension." Her words were gracious, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw, the micro-adjustments of her posture, the flicker of her eyes toward the fragment of silk resting on the table. Small signals, deliberate or unconscious, often betrayed the deeper truth. Mrs. Fairchild followed shortly, determined, vocal, and eager to assert her position. "I hear you are gathering evidence, Miss Marple," she exclaimed. "I hope you will not ignore the obvious. Henry Morton surely is at the heart of this." Her confidence, brimming with certainty, contrasted sharply with her subtle, nervous glances toward Edith and the door. Miss Marple allowed the accusation to hang in the air without comment, knowing that the interplay of reactions would provide more insight than words ever could. The final guest, Mr. Collins, entered quietly, offering polite greetings. His demeanor, careful and measured, suggested caution rather than fear. Miss Marple noted the faintest tensing of his shoulders as he took a seat, a subtle gesture that might indicate awareness of concealed truths. She served tea and pastries, her movements gentle and deliberate, allowing each person to relax, or reveal themselves, through conversation and observation. Once the tea was poured, Miss Marple began her test with an innocuous question. "I've been thinking about the churchyard and the funeral," she said lightly, "and about how some small items may go unnoticed by those not paying close attention. Do you recall, perhaps, anything unusual that caught your eye?" Her voice was calm, almost conversational, yet carefully designed to elicit reaction. She watched the eyes, the posture, the hesitation, and the micro-movements of each guest. Henry Morton's response was immediate and transparent. I only noticed the frost and, well, the people," he stammered, hands twisting in his lap. His fear was genuine, an instinctive reaction to the social pressure, not to guilt. Miss Marple nodded subtly, affirming his honesty without encouragement. Edith Lawton, however, paused. She looked at the fragment of silk on the table, then at Miss Marple. Her hands flexed slightly, brushing against the basket of pastries as though seeking a grounding point. Perhaps I noticed something," she said cautiously, voice steady but careful. "But it seemed unimportant at the time. Miss Marple observed the precision in her wording, the avoidance of specifics. The restraint suggested knowledge she was trying to mask, yet her control hinted at careful calculation rather than impulsive guilt. Mrs. Fairchild, confident in her assumptions, leaned forward. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "It must have been the boy, or perhaps Edith. Yes, I suspected her from the beginning." Her words were strong, yet her fingers drummed nervously on the table, betraying unease. Miss Marple smiled gently, saying nothing, letting the tension mount naturally. Finally, Mr. Collins reacted. His eyes flicked to the fragment of silk and then back to Miss Marple. For a moment, he was silent, his mouth tightening, hands resting uneasily on his knees. Then he cleared his throat. I did notice the silk," he admitted, voice controlled but strained. "But I thought it belonged to one of the ladies." Miss Marple noted the precise pause before he spoke, the slight downward tilt of his head, and the subtle reddening along the collar of his neck. His hesitation, though small, confirmed her suspicions. Miss Marple allowed the room to remain quiet, letting the tension build. She then spoke softly, deliberately, as if pondering aloud. "Curious. How small items can reveal so much, and how people respond to them differently. Some fear exposure, some misdirect attention, and some guard secrets carefully, even from themselves." Her gaze lingered on Mr. Collins, subtle but unmistakable. The effect was immediate. Mr. Collins shifted in his seat, his composure faltering for the first time since the events began. His fingers fidgeted, and the careful control of his expression wavered. Miss Marple observed calmly, noting the interplay of pride, fear, and the instinctive attempt to maintain appearances. Small gestures, an inhaled breath, a tightening of the jaw, the fleeting glance toward the door, betrayed awareness, intent, and ultimately, guilt. The rest of the villagers, watching from the tea-shop windows later, would remark on how Miss Marple's quiet conversation seemed ordinary. But she had achieved her purpose. The test had revealed the truth. Someone who understood subtlety, who anticipated reactions, and who could manipulate appearances had been drawn out by carefully timed conversation and strategic observation. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, knitting idle in her lap, her eyes serene yet piercing. The final test had succeeded. The true culprit, revealed through the art of human observation rather than accusation or force, had betrayed themselves through reaction, posture, and the smallest of gestures. Little Whittingham's web of secrets, carefully concealed, was beginning to unravel before her eyes, and the pieces were ready to be assembled into the full picture of what had transpired during the winter funeral. By the following morning, little Whittingham was quiet in a way that suggested anticipation rather than peace. Villagers went about their business with careful glances toward one another, and a subtle tension lingered over the frost-crusted lanes. Miss Marple, however, had already charted the course of events in her mind, and knew that the time had come to draw the threads together. Today, she would reveal the truth, gently, decisively, and without drama, allowing reason and observation to speak louder than accusation. She began by inviting all the key villagers to her cottage under the pretext of discussing the ongoing unease. Henry Morton, Edith Lawton, Mrs. Fairchild, and Mr. Collins arrived in turn, each carrying their own expectations, their own fears, and, in some cases, their own guilty secrets. Miss Marple, serene and composed as always, welcomed them with quiet politeness, serving tea and offering a seat by the fire. She did not rush, allowing the weight of anticipation to settle naturally, knowing that patience and timing would reveal more than urgency ever could. "The winter funeral has unsettled the village," she began, her tone calm, conversational, almost as though reflecting on village life rather than a crime. And it is remarkable, is it not, how small details can hold significance far beyond what we first perceive. She allowed her eyes to linger briefly on the altar fragment, then on the brooch, and finally on the subtle expressions of each guest. Micro-gestures, she knew, would betray truth faster than words. Henry Morton, seated nervously, shifted in his chair. His youthful anxiety was evident, hands twisting in his lap. Edith Lawton maintained her composure, though Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of her jaw as her gaze followed the silk fragment on the table. Mrs. Fairchild leaned forward eagerly, a faint gleam of triumph in her eyes, assuming that the obvious suspect, the boy, would be implicated. Mr. Collins, quiet and reserved, sat stiffly, betraying subtle tension in the careful set of his shoulders. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft. Let us consider what occurred in the churchyard. The apparent collapse, sudden and tragic, seemed to many an unfortunate accident. Yet some details were overlooked by all but the most observant. She placed the fragment of silk gently on the table. A mark on the altar step, a faint smear of soil, and this piece of fabric, traces unnoticed by the constable, dismissed by the anxious villagers, held more significance than anyone suspected. The group listened in tense silence. Miss Marple's words, calm yet precise, allowed the truth to form gradually in the space between explanation and observation. One might ask, who had reason, opportunity, and the skill to manipulate appearances so subtly? Who could place objects to mislead, anticipate the reactions of others, and yet appear entirely composed? Her gaze rested on Mr. Collins. A slight shift in his posture betrayed the first real sign of unease. The brooch, discovered near the churchyard gate, was no random accident, she continued. It was placed to draw attention, to misdirect, to heighten fear and suspicion among those who were quick to judge. The threatening letter, adorned with lavender and phrased with care, served the same purpose. Both acted to manipulate the village's perception, to ensure that the truth would be obscured beneath layers of distraction. Mr. Collins swallowed, his hands tightening slightly in his lap. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her eyes sharpened, as if tracing invisible lines in the air. Let us examine motives. The winter funeral, though outwardly a solemn occasion, concealed rivalries, resentments, and opportunities for advantage. There were past grievances over property, minor disputes resolved in secret, and a long-standing desire to protect reputation at all costs. Someone, knowing the habits of the villagers, used the occasion to enact a carefully orchestrated plan, relying not on force but on subtlety, observation, and manipulation. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she leaned forward slightly. Mr. Collins, you had access to the churchyard and an intimate knowledge of the habits of those attending the service. You observed the placement of the deceased, the positions of others, and the reactions of witnesses. You moved objects subtly, ensuring attention was directed elsewhere, and even left the fragment of silk to suggest misdirection. Your motive, though concealed, lay in long-standing grievances, minor though they seemed, and a desire to manipulate the outcome of events to protect yourself and your interests. Mr. Collins' face, previously composed, now betrayed unmistakable tension. His lips pressed together, then parted slightly, a faint exhalation escaping as if he could no longer suppress the truth. I did not mean for it to happen," he stammered. "It was not supposed to go so far. I only wanted to frighten him, only to make him aware of the error." His words faltered, yet Miss Marple's calm gaze reassured him that truth, once revealed, need not be met with shame. She nodded gently. "Yes, Mr. Collins, your intentions, twisted though they became in execution, were revealed in your careful orchestration, in the subtle misdirection, and in the minute clues left behind. The mark on the altar step, the fragment of silk, and the brooch were all tools of a plan, one that relied on psychology, fear, and distraction rather than force. Your guilt lies not in intent alone, but in the actions taken to ensure concealment." The other villagers listened, shock rippling through the room. Mrs. Fairchild gasped, muttering, "I never suspected him." Edith Lawton's hands tightened in her lap, a faint shiver running through her, while Henry Morton's eyes widened in relief at the exoneration of his own anxiety. The constable, present and observing, finally understood the subtleties he had overlooked. Human behavior, not merely testimony, had revealed the perpetrator. Miss Marple concluded, softly, "The winter funeral, though seemingly ordinary, exposed the depths of human nature in Little Whittingham. Fear, pride, secrecy, and observation all combined to conceal the truth. Yet careful attention to the smallest details, the unnoticed smear, the hidden fragment, the misaligned object, revealed a pattern. The deliberate actions of one, subtly manipulating perception, ultimately betrayed themselves. In a village such as ours, appearances often deceive, but truth, patiently observed, endures." Mr. Collins bowed his head, silent, accepting the inevitable. The others, though shaken, reflected on the precision of Miss Marple's reasoning. She had revealed the truth without scandal, without confrontation, beyond calm, deliberate exposition. The village, though unsettled, now had closure, and the subtle web of secrecy had been untangled by quiet observation, patient deduction, and an understanding of human nature that few could match. Miss Marple, serene and composed, set down her teacup and smiled faintly. Another mystery, carefully unraveled, another instance in which the truth lay not in force or accusation, but in the patient, subtle study of human behavior. Little Whittingham would remember the winter funeral for years to come, yet the real lesson lay not in the tragedy itself, but in the intricate dance of observation, patience, and the unassuming genius of a quiet woman who noticed what others overlooked. The first snow of the new week had settled over Little Whittingham, covering the village in a soft, glistening white. The lanes, once crisp with frost and lined with anxious eyes, were now quiet and orderly. Children skated along the frozen pond at the edge of the green, and villagers moved about their routines with careful smiles. Life had resumed its normal cadence, yet a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface, a collective memory of the winter funeral that had disrupted the calm for so long. Miss Marple, observing from the window of her cottage, sipped her tea slowly, her gaze drifting over the familiar rooftops dusted with snow. She thought of the events of the past 10 days, the subtle shifts in human behavior, and the careful orchestration of deceit that had been revealed. The village had returned to its outward composure, yet she knew that the small fractures of distrust and caution would remain, quietly shaping interactions for weeks to come. Henry Morton had resumed his visits to the market, though he walked with a more confident step than before. The fear that had shadowed his movements since the funeral had eased, replaced by relief and a cautious curiosity about the world of adults that had so unnerved him. Miss Marple observed him exchanging polite words with Mr. Collins, noting the careful balance between residual unease and a newfound understanding of human behavior. The boy had learned, in his own small way, that truth often required patience and observation more than immediate judgment. Edith Lawton had retreated to her cottage at the edge of the village, tending to her garden and her small collection of household chores. Her composure, tested throughout the investigation, had returned fully, though Miss Marple suspected that she carried with her a quiet awareness of human duplicity. The silk fragment, now safely tucked away in Miss Marple's careful archive of observations, had been returned discreetly to its proper owner, a small act of restoration amid the lingering tension. Mrs. Fairchild, ever vigilant and opinionated, had resumed her social rounds with a slight alteration in demeanor. She was no less eager to express her observations, but the dramatic certainty that had accompanied her accusations had softened. Miss Marple noted that the subtle recalibration in her behavior was a natural outcome of truth revealed. Once certainty was confirmed, suspicion lost some of its fire, though curiosity remained intact. Mr. Collins, now fully exposed as the orchestrator of the misdirection during the winter funeral, had retreated into himself, maintaining his business with quiet diligence. The revelation had been handled gently by Miss Marple, and the constable had ensured that proper legal procedures were followed. Yet, even as the village resumed daily routines, Mr. Collins carried the weight of his actions with a measured and visible humility. Miss Marple reflected on how human pride and secrecy often led even the most careful individuals into misjudged acts, especially when they believed themselves unnoticed. The vicar, for his part, had resumed his parish duties with calm authority. He continued to check the churchyard and adjust arrangements meticulously, a quiet ritual of order after the chaos. Miss Marple visited him briefly, discussing the need to maintain both vigilance and patience in the face of human unpredictability. The vicar listened attentively, nodding in agreement, and acknowledged the importance of small details, frost, fragments, and minor disturbances that could reveal more than the eye initially perceived. In the market, conversation was more subdued than usual. The letter, the brooch, and the winter funeral itself had become topics of polite reflection rather than heated debate. Villagers shared anecdotes of minor events during the preceding days, often embellishing for effect, yet all tempered with awareness of Miss Marple's quiet presence in their midst. They respected her judgment, her patience, and the subtle genius with which she had untangled the threads of secrecy and manipulation. Miss Marple herself continued her daily walks, observing human behavior as always. She noted how the small interactions, an exchange of greetings, a pause at the post office, a glance toward the churchyard, carried traces of the tension that had permeated the village. Even as normalcy returned, the human element remained complex and layered. Trust, suspicion, pride, and curiosity intertwined seamlessly, shaping every gesture and word in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. As the afternoon light waned, Miss Marple took up her knitting by the fire, reflecting on the winter funeral and the chain of events it had initiated. She thought of the subtle misdirection, the careful orchestration of objects, and the skill with which human psychology had been manipulated. And yet, she reminded herself, the same careful observation that had allowed the perpetrator to exploit the village had also revealed the truth. Human behavior, she considered, was both the instrument of deception and the key to revelation. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the fragment of silk neatly preserved in her hand. She thought of how such a small item, almost invisible amidst the frost and the noise of everyday life, had held the key to unraveling the complex web of fear, secrecy, and manipulation. The mark on the altar step, the brooch at the churchyard gate, the reactions of each villager, all had contributed to the eventual revelation. The smallest details, patiently observed, had exposed the subtle mind behind the misdirection. She reflected, too, on the nature of human intentions. People acted from pride, fear, curiosity, or simple habit, often unaware of the consequences of their choices. Even careful planning could unravel when confronted with patient observation, gentle questioning, and the ability to perceive the faintest signs of discomfort or evasion. The winter funeral had been a lesson not merely in detecting guilt, but in understanding the depths of human nature. As evening descended, the village settled into quiet reflection. Smoke curled from chimneys, windows glowed warmly against the early winter dusk, and the frost shimmered under the pale moonlight. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting calmly, her thoughts serene yet alert. Little Whittingham had returned to its routines, yet beneath the surface, the awareness of human complexity lingered. The events of the past days had reminded her, and the villagers, that appearances could deceive, and that careful observation was the most reliable guide to truth. At last, with the fire crackling softly and the room bathed in the glow of lamplight, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, hands folded over her knitting. She considered the village, the incident, and the subtle forces that had shaped it all. The winter funeral had ended, yet the lessons remained. Patience, observation, and a gentle understanding of human nature were often more powerful than accusation or force. Little Whittingham, quiet and settled for now, would remember the winter funeral, and the woman who quietly unraveled its mysteries would continue her watch as composed and perceptive as ever. Weeks had passed since the winter funeral, yet little Whittingham carried within it the subtle residue of unease. Snow had melted from the rooftops, leaving patches of frost on windowsills and soft mud along the lanes. Villagers returned to routine, but the collective memory of the unsettling events lingered, shaping behaviors, conversations, and the cautious glances that had become habitual. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with knitting in hand, observed these small traces, noting that even when the overt drama ended, its echoes remained in the rhythm of daily life. Henry Morton had grown noticeably quieter, more thoughtful. The boy, once timid in the market and hesitant in greetings, now offered measured words and careful smiles. Miss Marple had seen this change as a sign of maturing understanding. Children, when confronted by human complexity, often either grew timid or developed a precocious awareness of subtlety. Henry, she reflected, had acquired the latter. He had witnessed firsthand how minor gestures, expressions, and concealed motives could drive an entire village to suspicion and fear. Edith Lawton, meanwhile, returned to her quiet routines. She tended her garden with deliberate care, trimming hedges and pruning roses as though shaping not only plants, but also the boundaries of her own space. Miss Marple noted the way she moved with intention, a renewed caution in her gaze, and the occasional reflective pause as she considered the world beyond her cottage. The experience of the funeral and its aftermath had left its mark. Edith's composure now carried a subtle edge, a readiness to observe before trusting, to measure before revealing. Mrs. Fairchild, conversely, had resumed her social rounds with her usual zeal, though the sharp certainty that once defined her speech had softened. She had become slightly more circumspect in gossip, aware that not every assumption carried truth. Yet the thrill of observation remained, and Miss Marple often saw her seated in the tea shop, leaning forward with wide eyes, eager to catch glimpses of unspoken interactions. Curiosity, she reflected, was a force difficult to extinguish, even when tempered by experience. Mr. Collins, the orchestrator of subtle misdirection during the winter funeral, maintained a subdued presence in the village. His business thrived quietly, yet his demeanor had changed. He no longer moved with casual confidence, but with measured care. Miss Marple, observing him discreetly from her window, noted the lingering weight of consequence on his shoulders. Even when actions are revealed gently, as hers had been, guilt and self-awareness remain persistent companions. The church itself, once a site of solemn ritual and hidden tension, resumed its usual rhythm. Services were attended, hymns sung, and candles lit. Yet Miss Marple noticed the faint hesitations at the altar, the careful placement of cushions, and the discreet cleaning of steps and rails that had once borne subtle clues. The parishioners, though outwardly unconcerned, retained a subconscious memory of events, a recognition that, even in routine, small anomalies could carry significance. The village's collective attention, honed by experience, had been sharpened, without its members fully realizing it. Miss Marple, as always, walked the lanes at dusk. She observed interactions that, to the casual eye, were ordinary. A greeting, a brief exchange of news, a shared glance. Yet to her, each movement, each hesitation, told a story. Trust, suspicion, pride, and humility all intertwined in subtle ways. She noted how villagers had adapted. Their gestures, once careless, now carried the imprint of careful observation. Even small children in the playground or by the pond moved with an awareness born of listening and watching adults. She reflected on the nature of human behavior with gentle satisfaction. The winter funeral had revealed the complexities of hidden motives, of pride and fear, and the extraordinary power of subtle influence. In a village as contained as Little Whittingham, a single individual's actions had ripple effects, shaping not only immediate events, but also long-term behaviors and social interactions. Miss Marple's satisfaction lay not in the revelation of guilt alone, but in the understanding that observation, patience, and an empathetic grasp of human nature could illuminate truths that otherwise remained concealed. One afternoon, she invited the key villagers to tea once more, not to discuss guilt or evidence, but to reflect on the events and the lessons learned. Henry Morton, Edith Lawton, Mrs. Fairchild, and even Mr. Collins attended. Miss Marple spoke gently about the importance of attentiveness, the value of reflection, and the consequences of actions, subtle and overt. The conversation flowed calmly, yet under the surface she observed the same micro-gestures, the same fleeting expressions that had once revealed guilt or suspicion. It was a final lesson in awareness, imparted not through accusation, but through measured, reflective dialogue. The winter funeral, though concluded in action and resolution, persisted in memory. The villagers carried within them an understanding of human complexity that would guide behavior for months, perhaps years, to come. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, recognized the enduring lesson. Even when appearances deceive, patient observation and careful attention to subtle signs reveal the deeper truths of intention, character, and consequence. As night fell over Little Whittingham, smoke curling from chimneys and the streets bathed in pale moonlight, Miss Marple sat by her fire, serene and composed. The village had returned to its routines, yet its awareness had deepened. Trust, suspicion, and human curiosity intertwined in a delicate balance, tempered by the quiet knowledge that even ordinary days could conceal extraordinary truths. In her heart, she understood that mysteries never truly ended. They persisted in human behavior, in subtle glances, in unspoken thoughts, and in the delicate dance of observation and understanding. The winter funeral had ended, the culprit revealed, and the village's social order restored, yet Miss Marple knew the rhythms of human nature would always bring new puzzles. She smiled faintly, hands moving over her knitting, confident that when the next mystery arose, inevitable in a world of human complexity, she would watch, listen, and discern, quietly unraveling the threads that others overlooked. Little Whittingham was calm for now, but under the surface, life's subtle mysteries continued, ready to challenge, intrigue, and teach those patient enough to observe. Winter had loosened its grip on Little Whittingham, though the occasional flurry of snow still dusted the village roofs and lanes. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. The market bustled in measured activity. The church bells chimed with serene regularity, and smoke spiraled lazily from chimneys into the crisp air. Yet beneath this outward calm, Miss Marple knew, the village retained an undercurrent of memory. The winter funeral, the letters, the brooch, and the subtle manipulations had left an indelible impression, shaping behaviors in ways unseen, yet profoundly felt. Miss Marple walked slowly along the high street that morning, observing the familiar sights and sounds with her usual attentive serenity. She noticed Henry Morton carrying parcels for the grocer, a careful spring in his step that spoke of newfound confidence tempered by the lessons he had learned. Children played near the village pond, cautious of the slippery ice, yet infused with the innocent curiosity that Miss Marple understood was the foundation of human observation. She smiled faintly, noting that the smallest minds could reflect the lessons of subtle awareness almost as keenly as adults. Edith Lawton tended to her garden with meticulous care, clipping roses and pruning hedges with deliberate precision. Miss Marple had observed the quiet transformation in her demeanor over the past weeks. Composure strengthened, awareness heightened, and a faint shadow of vigilance lingering in her gaze. Life, even in ordinary routines, now carried an added weight of reflection for those who had been touched by the events surrounding the winter funeral. Awareness of human complexity, Miss Marple mused, was a subtle inheritance from experiences that revealed both character and intention. Mrs. Fairchild, whose gossip had once carried dramatic certainty, had adjusted her tone slightly. She remained the village's keen observer, seated in her favorite chair at the tea shop, eyes flicking toward the door with mild curiosity rather than suspicion. Miss Marple noted the subtle recalibration. Pride tempered, accusation softened, and her energy now flowed into observation rather than conjecture. Even the most opinionated villagers, she reflected, learned in time that patience and reflection often outweighed the impulse to judge. Mr. Collins, the man whose careful orchestration had initially misled the village, continued his business with subdued diligence. Though his guilt had been revealed gently and without scandal, the experience had left him permanently altered. Miss Marple, observing him from a distance, saw the caution in his movements, the measured attention to interactions, and the quiet weight of consequence he carried. Even when truth is unveiled with care, the lessons of conscience and self-awareness remain. Miss Marple herself returned to her cottage, the fire crackling warmly as she settled into her favorite chair. She took up her knitting, her eyes wandering toward the window to the snow-dusted lanes. She reflected upon the intricate web of human behavior revealed during the winter funeral, the subtle misdirection, the careful manipulation of perception, and the profound impact of observation. It had been, she considered, an elegant lesson in the enduring complexity of human nature. The fragment of silk, now safely tucked away, remained a small but potent reminder of how the smallest details could illuminate truth. The brooch, a delicate floral emblem found near the churchyard gate, had served as both misdirection and revelation. Each element, from the smear on the altar step to the threatening letter scented faintly with lavender, had been part of a carefully orchestrated psychological puzzle. And through it all, Miss Marple's patient attention to human behavior, rather than reliance on force or formal investigation, had brought clarity. The villagers, she observed, had been subtly changed by the events. Awareness, careful attention, and reflection had been imparted without ceremony or instruction. People moved through the village now with a more measured sense of observation, their interactions shaped by memory and experience rather than impulse alone. Fear had subsided, but the lessons of the winter funeral, the delicate interplay of secrecy, pride, and human motivation, would remain embedded in their routines. Miss Marple considered the constable diligent yet conventional in method, and reflected on the importance of complementing official procedures with quiet observation. The constable had focused on evidence, testimony, and the obvious, yet it was the subtle readings of human gestures, hesitations, and inconsistencies that had ultimately revealed the truth. She noted how the combination of patience, empathy, and attentiveness to the smallest human behaviors could illuminate even the most carefully concealed motives. The churchyard, once the stage for suspicion and misdirection, now lay serene under the pale winter sun. Candles flickered in the chapel windows, their glow reflecting the warmth that persisted in the hearts of those who had survived the tension. Miss Marple wandered briefly among the gravestones, noting the small imperfections, the slight lean of a stone, a scattering of frost that mirrored the imperfections of human nature. Even in calm, she mused, subtle truths endured, waiting for attentive eyes to perceive them. By evening, the village had settled fully into quiet reflection. Smoke drifted from chimneys, the lamplight glimmered along the streets, and the distant chiming of the church bell echoed softly. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, hands folded over her knitting, serene and composed. She reflected on the events and the lessons learned. That human behavior, with all its subtle signals, its hesitations, its pride and fear, carried truths often invisible to casual observers, yet revealed to those patient enough to watch and listen. In the final calm of the day, Miss Marple considered the enduring nature of mystery itself. Events like the winter funeral did not merely end with revelation or closure. They left traces, subtle and persistent, shaping interactions, fostering awareness, and instilling lessons in observation. Little Whittingham, peaceful once more, carried within it the echoes of human complexity, an awareness that even ordinary lives contained extraordinary truths, waiting for a perceptive mind to uncover them. And so Miss Marple sat, the snow falling quietly outside, her knitting resting on her lap, eyes observing and mind reflecting. The winter funeral had concluded, the culprit revealed, and the village returned to routine. Yet beneath that surface, the lessons endured. Patience, observation, empathy, and the careful study of human nature were the keys to understanding. Life in Little Whittingham, as ever, would continue, quietly interwoven with mysteries, lessons, and the unassuming presence of a woman who noticed what others overlooked, who perceived what others dismissed, and who understood that truth, however subtle, always revealed itself to the patient eye.